News First, Newsline Prime with Faraz Shaukat.
And a splendid evening to you. This is Newsline Live, Newsline Prime live from the Newsfirst studios in Dawson Street in Colombo. My guest today is a defense analyst and a researcher for the Bandaranaike Center for International Studies. His writing revolves around global security and having covered many issues like hybrid warfare, lethal drones, maritime piracy, and so on. He's right here with us in the studio to help us understand better what terrorism, what the message is from Black Easter. He's right here. Good evening to you, Mr. Nilanthan.
Good evening. Thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure, and thank you very much for coming on to Newsline Prime. What these blasts on Easter Sunday, what do these blasts tell us about terrorism?
Well, firstly, it tells us that the way that we understand terrorism perhaps needs to be revised. One of the common misconceptions, for example, is that terrorism is often caused by poverty and deprivation and suppression. But I think the recent model of terrorism that we've seen both in Sri Lanka, which is a sequence of attacks around the world over the last couple of years, shows that sometimes even the foot soldiers these days come from middle-class, educated backgrounds. Of course, in the 70s and 80s, this whole idea that terrorism is caused by poverty and deprivation, that's when it took hold. But I don't think those conceptions really hold true today. And we see that from the identities of the bombers.
They were, it's almost simple to say they were but two. And perhaps the others were not as affluent as those two.
Well, that's true, but if we look at the series of ISIS-inspired attacks that we've seen over the last couple of years, and there have been a number of reports on this, particularly in places like Europe. So MI6, for example, has been quite open in its data, and they've said that about 2/3 of British suspects on their database come from middle-class, educated backgrounds. And a think tank in France recently, in 2016, published a survey which said that the foreign fighters from France in Syria and Iraq, once again, about 2/3 of them are from middle-class families, and 2/3 of them are educated as well. So I see this as being a part of a larger transformation that insurgency and terrorism are currently undergoing.
Well, talking about foreign terrorists and so on,
Yes.
Two things come to mind. I'll take the first, which is that there is some, Minister Vasanta Senanaika said that around 50 Turkish nationals came to this country, and that this information was provided by the Turkish embassy to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and at the time Mr. Senanaika was serving at the Foreign Ministry, and he did so till October 2018. So somewhere between 2017 and October 2018, the Sri Lankan Foreign Ministry was privy to some information shared by the Turkish representation here in Sri Lanka, and we've not heard much more about this. Do you think that there was a real possibility that some of these foreign terrorists came here and coached or participated in some form of way, either by brainwashing or whatever, or even the education and the manufacture of weapons and so on? Do you think there was a real possibility? Well,
to be honest, given what we know about smuggling and trafficking and poaching in the Indian Ocean, I wouldn't be surprised if there were smuggling channels through which foreign insurgents and foreign trainers could have come here. This once again enforces the notion that we need secure borders, we need secure maritime borders as well. And there are also reports that the mastermind of the bombings himself, in this case, traveled frequently between Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu using smuggling routes.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Except that the Turkish information, the way we understand it, the way I understand it, is that it contained names and passport numbers indicating that these people arrived in Sri Lanka through established genuine channels, through the airport or through the port.
Well, if their cover stories were convincing, I suppose they could have come through the legal channels, they could have come through the normal channels if they had used aliases and identities which would have possibly gotten past the authorities here. I would be skeptical about the scale in which it happened, but I certainly do think we should be open to that possibility given what's happened.
Now, going back to these blasts and this widespread notion that somehow terrorism is associated with deprivation and suppression, I don't think there'll be anyone in this country who can genuinely sustain an argument that some communities are subject to this deprivation and suppression. There have been incidents in the past, of course, like in Kandy, in Alutgama, and wherever else. But by and large, the Sri Lankan mind is rather liberal thinking, and the communities do get on
Yes.
fine. I mean, okay, we had terrorism, but that wasn't the community at large. It was a specific group of terrorists who happened to be mainly from the one community, which doesn't mean that all the community are terrorists. So how much of this terrorism has been fueled by the perception that there is some state apathy towards the betterment of a particular community, like in this case the Muslim community?
Well, there are certain insurgencies where there's a clear link between deprivation and terrorism, but as we're just discussing, I don't particularly see that link here, because once again, by any economic indicators, we could argue that most of the communities here are relatively well off in terms of the South Asian context. Comparatively, we are ahead of many of our neighbors in terms of per capita income and things like that. And I would say it's more through the form of indoctrination. The recent spate of attacks that we see all over the world seem to predominantly rely on sort of educated youth who now know enough to be indoctrinated, which is a pretty weird phenomenon if you think about it. Because
so it makes brainwashing quite. There's no need for brainwashing.
Ironically, being educated seems to make it easier for them to be brainwashed.
I see.
Because there are scriptures that you can quote, there are various historical examples that you can give. People who are educated are often quite easy to fool if you give them something that fits their frame of reference, that fits their narrative, and they would often start sticking to it. And that seems to be the model which ISIS currently uses to sort of exploit knowledge.
But when you said this about education, a word came to my mind, and I'm struggling to find the equivalent English word, but I think it's Tamil. And there's this saying, sometimes you hear the older folks saying, Arapadichavan. Is that it? Is this the opposite of that?
I mean, it's almost that. It's a group of people, a class of people who are educated in terms of having gone through the institutional process of...
so this is the opposite of Arapadichavan?
Yes, this is a perverted version of it, yes.
Yes, because this is they are highly educated.
Exactly, and there's an English saying that there are certain things that you would be foolish enough to believe only if you were educated.
Right.
And this is one of those cases.
All right, well, it's very easy when Sri Lanka was in the process of re-establishing its unity, its reconciliation, its island living style for nearly 10 years since the end of the war.
Yeah.
It's very easy when after Black Easter to compare what happened on Black Easter with the LTTE? Why is it different?
Well, it's different in the sense that with the LTT, they had a clear set of demands, and we knew what they expected from the Sri Lankan state. We knew what they expected from the Sri Lankan people when they attacked us. However, here there is no clear articulated position on what the attacks were for. There are some who say that it was revenge for the Christchurch attacks. There are some who say that...
But why Sri Lanka then?
Well, so once again, I suppose it would fit into the larger picture of ISIS moving many of its operations, psychological operations, into a different part of the world, because what we need to realize is that 2018 was a bad year for ISIS in the Middle East in terms of losing a lot of territory and having to retreat from the conventional battlefield. And they seem to have identified South India and the southern part of the subcontinent, so to speak, as a prime testing ground for this new model where you would find individual extremist groups or families in some cases. And whenever you lose a major battle in the Middle East, an attack here would sort of help you save face, would help ISIS save face. So what we are seeing here is the shift of a territorial battle in the Middle East into other parts of the world.
I know that your speciality is global security. But I ask you, Mr. Nilanthan, what happened in Sri Lanka that helped Daesh, IS, to identify that there would be people in Sri Lanka with a fertile enough mind, fertile enough mindset for Daesh, IS to take advantage of?
Well, my suspicion is that they must have seen the videos that were being circulated, some of the preaching and the hate speech and things like that, and I think they identified that they had a charismatic personality who could not only indoctrinate other people, but who could be indoctrinated by them. They are always on the lookout, especially so before the Ramzan fasting season, there's always a spike in ISIS activities, and this is where many of them also look out to various parts around the world for young soldiers, as they call it, to do their work. So I'm quite sure that as they were planning for this, they identified him as someone. Once again, this is something that takes months to happen, by the way, so I'm not suggesting that all of this happened in the space of a few weeks. Right? It's quite possible that this happened during the space of years.
Well, approximately 3 years ago, the Muslim Council of Sri Lanka reported Zaran
Absolutely.
for his hate mongering, hate speeches, and his hate preaching, and for his particular brand of the interpretation of the Holy Quran.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, we're told by members of the Muslim Council that the intelligence services had told them that there's nothing they can do because this character wasn't even using a mobile phone, and that he was hiding somewhere in South India, which is something that you yourself alluded to earlier.
Yes.
When that's happened, what happened to our super duper intelligence apparatus? What happened there?
Well, so in my sort of objective analysis, your intelligence agencies can only be as good as the political backing that they receive. It's quite easy for us to look at isolated incidents and call those intelligence failures when we look at them in a vacuum. But if you look at the overall context of how intelligence agencies functions, when there's a gulf between the intelligence community and the political community, when they feel that they aren't being listened to, when they feel that their priorities are not really being taken seriously, these lapses are always likely to happen. So I would say that this is not particularly due to an intelligence agency failure. This is more because of what seems to have been a gap between intelligence agencies and the political community.
And that political divide is actually, there's a big abyss between the two, the president and the prime minister.
Well, yes. I mean, once again, as an objective analyst, I wouldn't sort of...
I'm not asking you to take sides.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is, every Sri Lankan adult and their dogs understand that there is a fundamental difference between the President and the Prime Minister and his team. It appears to me that the Prime Minister, for example, is struggling. On the one hand, we have Cardinal Malcolm Ramjit, no less, and no one's arguing with him, that he was told that they had the intelligence, but that law and order wasn't within their purview. And therefore, period. We then have the same Prime Minister talking with international media outlets like Sky News, Channel 4, and
BBC.
the BBC, in which he absolutely denies having received this knowledge. But how do you run a country when the first thing, this is a highly classified document carrying a for your eyes only classification of secrecy. It's top level. You don't send a for your eyes only notification when somebody's lost a car or a burglary or whatever it is. This is highly sensitive. And it beggars belief that the letter on the Defense Ministry note paper, written by a deputy of somebody who works under the Defense Secretary, wrote to the IGP and told the IGP, and the IGP then sent it down the line to his deputies. And yet, the Prime Minister didn't know, and yet the President didn't know. Come on, Mr. Nilanthan. Sri Lanka is a highly educated country. The literacy rate's over 90%. How many people believe that story?
I mean, so I agree that that it's quite shocking. It's quite shocking that something like this could have happened, and that both the quote-unquote heads of state seem to have been unaware of a threat of this magnitude. Of course, I would say we have to take them at their word, and of course, people would argue that objectively speaking, it's a little hard to buy that story. However,
apart from buy it, it'll be pretty hard for people like us to sell that story.
Yes. I mean, to be honest, I have nothing to sort of defend the establishment with.
But I want to ask you another question. Some people that I've met in the last several days suggest that they're very angry, obviously, at what has happened. Angry because this, by and large, peaceful scenario has been shattered and caught everyone off guard, including the government and so on. How possible is it that until end of 2014, the defense establishment paid particular attention to security and intelligence? Sorry. How possible is it that the incoming government in 2015 relaxed their attitude towards security and intelligence because they felt that they had this newfound friendship with the West?
Well, this is where the question of political will comes in. When an administration has security as one of its top priorities, you often don't find things like this happening because the security forces feel like they're listened to. There's a proper infrastructure that the state can resort to prevent things like this. So it all boils down, if you ask me, to political will. How committed is a political establishment to protecting a country? And the balance between security and freedom, it's always a tightrope that you have to walk. It's always a fine balancing act, and some governments seem to favor security, some governments seem to favor freedom, and sometimes that balance is just completely skewed.
Well, it's so skewed that we have 254 people dead from 9 different countries.
Yeah.
Around 500 people injured, and some still in the ICU. 294, I'm being told. Now, Do you think it would help the whole overall situation if the government stopped blaming each other, because the government is two here, that they stop blaming each other and they get down to grips with looking at the families of the victims, the injured, and in getting this country back on target? I mean, you don't bomb the Shangri-La and expect people to turn up on holiday the next week. The blessed place is still being rebuilt. What do you think the government ought to be doing?
As you said, the biggest obstacle right now seems to be a lack of political coherence, because we have plenty of positives to take away from this entire thing, but the big block towards reaching any kind of long-term mechanism or resolution, all of that will depend on political will. So, for example, I think religious institutions, the security forces, and the public deserve a huge deal of credit for the way that things have played out. I mean, considering the psychological and physical scale of the attacks, the security forces, religious figures, and the public deserve a huge amount of credit for preventing things from spiraling out of control in the form of riots and mass retributive killings and large-scale mob violence and things like that. That simply hasn't happened. So it is a testament to our security forces, religious institutions, and the public in general that we've kept it under control. However, for this to translate into meaningful mechanisms and measures, there needs to be political cohesion. There needs to be political will.
Isn't it better I know the work that the church and the other ecclesiastical organizations are carrying out to keep the anger,
keep the peace,
and to keep the peace. In a way, they're policing, community policing, which is wonderful. But isn't it up to the politicians? Because the leaders of any faith are not politicians. Isn't it about time that it is the politicians who did this work? Not politicians who are apparently still focused on corruption. We had a case where they tried to supply tabs to A-level students, and that got stuck in the cabinet of ministers. Now they've come up with something a little bit better, laptops. It appears to me that they are focused on cutting a deal, come what may, and certainly before the next election. Isn't it time, sorry, I didn't want to drag you into that, but isn't it time really that the government got the troops together? The Defense Secretary has resigned. Is there a case that can be brought against him for murder by omission?
Well, when there's political will, anything is possible. If, for example, the political establishment feels that someone needs to be held accountable for this, then interpreting the law in a manner which would allow for that is quite easy. The question is whether there would be political will or not. And I think people more acquainted with domestic politics here would know the answer to that better.
What about this statement from dear Prime Minister? Unfortunately, because he's in the front line, I have to ask these questions. Right? So I'm asking you this. What about that statement he made that there were no laws in Sri Lanka to charge people for being members of a foreign organization, terrorist organization?
Yeah, that's unfortunately not true. There are a number of legal avenues that the government could have pursued if there was political will. There's the Prevention of Terrorism Act. We could have used our own penal code. Do
you think the Prime Minister should have relied on better advisors?
It would seem so, because I don't think that answer really demonstrated that the state was well aware of the legal aspect of this entire thing. I mean, ISIS is banned by the UN Security Council. We could have cited that. Or if there was any kind of political support, we could have created a new law that if they were not comfortable with.
So all these British citizens who've gone off to Syria and then changed their minds, And instead of, when they try and return to Britain, they'll get arrested in Britain because Britain has those laws. So how possible is it for those people to end up in a country like Sri Lanka? Because the Sri Lankan Prime Minister says, we've got no laws to control that.
Well, and that again shows why that was such a sort of deep mistake, because it's simply not true. And as you stated, the last thing we want is to send out a signal all across the world that if you are an insurgent in another part of the world, that Sri Lanka is a country without a legal mechanism to prosecute you. That's simply
the
not
Prime
true.
Minister seems to be always relying on advisors or advice that, you know, poses more questions than anything else. And the reason I say this is because in the Presidential Commission bond report, there is a bit that the two learned judges of the Supreme Court and the Deputy Retired Auditor General says that in matters such as, there's one particular aspect when they say that the Prime Minister would have been better advised if he had not relied upon the submissions made by Arjuna Mahendran, his hand-picked choice to be governor, and Dr. Samarisiri. That's one thing that they say, and my hairs are standing up, because you're saying the same kind of thing, that he should have had better advice.
In this context,
In
yes.
this context, yes.
In this context,
Got
yes.
that.
Yes.
Because don't want to drag you into the point.
Thank you.
Now then, what steps can be taken to avoid this? You know, they've now created this Overall Operations Council, haven't they?
Yeah, Overall Operations Command. Currently it applies to the Western Province and Puntland, but I think it's a step in the right direction. So our security forces, particularly our tri-forces, even after the LTT insurgency was over, have been quite active both on the practical side and the intellectual side, which we should all be sort of grateful for in terms of training for new types of scenarios, military drills for new scenarios on the practical side, and also publications and seminars and conferences on the intellectual side. Our tri-forces have been quite ahead of the curve, if you will, in terms of keeping up with the modern trends in warfare. And the result has been the way in which the situation, the infrastructure of the sort of insurgents, of the extremists rather, that have been dismantled very quickly. So the OOC is essentially a center under which some of these operations can be brought under one roof. It's certainly a step in the right direction, and I think we should all be happy that our armed forces have been on top of the game, so to speak, in this context.
Do you think the armed forces are enough on top of the game to arrest all these sympathizers and deal with them under the provisions of the law?
Yeah, absolutely. So as someone who has worked in some capacity or the other with them quite regularly, I can tell you that in terms of dealing with a tangible enemy, right, we have one of the best armed forces in the world. Of course, certainly in terms of track record, I would argue that there are not many countries that have the same track record as our tri-forces. So as long as you give them the political will, which is what I keep coming back to, I have complete faith in our security forces, our tri-forces in particular.
Well, Mr. Nilanthan, thank you very much for having come here and been so eloquent and open about your analysis, which is always refreshing. But I want to ask you the final question. One of our politicians said, we'll be back on track in 3 months. Is that wishful thinking, or are the people of Sri Lanka safe now?
Well, in terms of dismantling the infrastructure of the tangible enemy and ideology that we have right now, I would say it is possible within 3 months. But in terms of the people, restoring confidence in the minds of people, in the minds of investors, in the minds of visitors and tourists, even now there's tangible, palpable tension in the air, even when you sort of walk on that psychological factor. I think will take a lot more than 3 months. But in terms of simply dealing with a tangible enemy, I feel that we are capable of dealing with it over the course of the next 3 months.
As far as investors are concerned, quite a number of investments proposed turned out to be hoaxes. So On that note,
Those are your words, not mine.
that's absolutely right. That's my words. And if I was given a minute more, I can start telling you all about Volkswagen and all sorts of jolly things like that. Well, that's the way it was on Newsline Prime. Mr. Nilanthan, thank you ever so much for being on the program.
My pleasure, thank you.
Delighted to have you. And that's the way it was. So do watch the 9 o'clock news tonight. We'll give you some more details on various transactions that are taking place in Sri Lanka in the face of growing adversity. Take care, have a great evening, and God bless.
News First, Newsline Prime with Faraz Shaukat Ali.